March 6th, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The oxygen mask froze against Major Hans Kobler's face as he scanned the crystalline sky through his Messid Bf-109G6's canopy. Leading his mixed formation of fighters toward the bomber stream, his ground controllers had promised would be unescorted at this altitude. This deep into the Reich, Indiana, at 12 o'clock, high single-engine fighters with drop tanks. The warning crackled through his headset. In growing panic, Kogler's blood turned to ice water. American fighters, single-engine fighters, here over Brandenburg, less than 50 miles from Berlin. It was impossible. No Allied single-engine fighter possessed the range to penetrate this far into Germany and return to England. The maximum escort range of the American P-47 Thunderbolt was Aachen, barely scratching German airspace. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning could reach Hanover on a good day, but Brandenburg, Berlin itself, this shattered every calculation, every assumption, every defensive strategy. The Luftwaffe had built since the American daylight bombing campaign began. As Kogler watched the glinting silver shapes grow larger, their distinctive squared wingtips and sleek profiles becoming unmistakable, he understood with crystalline clarity that he was witnessing the beginning of the end. These were not the stubby Thunderbolts or twin-boomed Lightnings they had learned to engage at the extreme edge of their range. These were North American P-51B Mustangs, and they moved through the sky with the easy confidence of predators who knew they had fuel to burn, altitude to spare, and all the time in the world to hunt. 730 heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were approaching Berlin, not the usual feint toward the capital before turning to secondary targets, but a direct assault on the heart of the Third Reich, and for the first time in the history of aerial warfare, single-engine fighters would escort them all the way there and all the way back. What Kogler and his formation of 7 twin-engine Mi-10 and 41 Mi-1000s and 9s did not know was that this moment would trigger the most profound psychological collapse in the history of military aviation. A complete destruction, not just of aircraft and pilots, but of the very belief system that had sustained German air superiority since 1939. The mathematics of annihilation were being written, not in the conference rooms of the Air Ministry, but in the contrails streaking across the Brandenburg sky. At Angels 28, the shock had actually begun building weeks before, though few in the Luftwaffe High Command had connected the dots on January 11th, 1944. Major Hermann Graf, commanding JG-11, had encountered American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, 150 miles deeper into Germany than they should have been able to fly. His after-action report suggesting these fighters must have refueled at secret bases in Sweden was dismissed by Berlin as combat fatigue affecting judgment, but the sightings multiplied. Hanover on January 29th, Magda on February 3rd. Each report pushed the known envelope of American fighter range further east, and each was met with official denial. The Reich Air Ministry issued a directive on February 15th stating categorically that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr are misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s or friendly aircraft pilots. Making such claims will be subject to medical evaluation. The truth was far more disturbing then. Swedish conspiracies or pilot hallucinations at Wright Field in Ohio. American engineers had achieved what German technical experts had declared physically impossible, extending the P-51B Mustang's combat radius to over 650 miles using expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. The mathematics seemed to violate the basic laws of aerodynamics. A single-engine fighter carrying enough fuel to fly 1,300 miles while maintaining combat performance was, according to German calculations, an engineering impossibility. Hedman Heinz Knock, who commanded 2nd Squadron of Jagdstade 11, wrote in his diary in early 1944, "We had calculated precisely the American single-engine fighters could escort their bombers 280 miles from their bases in England, no further. This gave us all of Central and Eastern Germany as a hunting ground where we could attack the bomber streams without interference. It was simple arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. The Americans could not change the laws of physics. But the Americans had not changed the laws of physics. They had simply applied them more creatively than anyone in the German High Command had imagined possible. The secret lay not in the aircraft itself, but in 2 revolutionary innovations that German intelligence had either missed or dismissed as propaganda: the Packard-built Merlin engine and the British-designed paper drop tanks, the Packard 516503 engine in the P-51B was not merely a licensed copy of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an improved version manufactured to tolerances that exceeded even the original. British specifications using American mass production techniques refined in Detroit's automotive plants, Packard had achieved something remarkable, an engine that produced 1,490 horsepower at sea level and crucially maintained over 1,200 horsepower at 30,000 feet, thanks to its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, Oberfeld. Weighable Conrad Bauer, a technical specialist with JG-26, examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944. His report, discovered in Luftwaffe archives after the war, reveals the German amazement. The engine installation is a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. The intercooler system alone is more sophisticated than anything in our Daimler-Benz 605. But most remarkable is the production quality. Every component is machined to jeweler's precision. Yet they tell us, the intercooler. Americans build 3 of these engines every hour. If true, this is not a war of pilots, but of production lines. The drop tanks represented an even more elegant solution, constructed from pressed paper impregnated with plastic resin. These 108-gallon auxiliary tanks weighed just 35 pounds, empty, lighter than the ammunition for one of the Mustang's machine guns. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed the laminated craft paper construction method, which could hold fuel for approximately 5 hours before beginning to break down. This was more than sufficient for the 2.5-hour flight to Berlin. German engineers had experimented with auxiliary tanks, but their approach reflected a fundamental philosophical difference. The German tanks were metal, reusable, expensive, and heavy. They degraded performance so severely that fighters carrying them were vulnerable to attack. The American paper tanks were cheap, disposable, and light. A P-51B with 2 108 drop tanks could fly to Berlin, jettison the tanks in seconds when entering combat, and fight with full performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zenke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, explained the tactical revolution in a 1944 briefing. The Germans expected us to husband our fuel, to save enough for combat and return. But with drop tanks, we could burn fuel like millionaires cruise to Berlin on the external tanks, drop them, and still have our full internal fuel load for 30 minutes of combat at full throttle, plus the flight home. We weren't flying on the edge anymore. We had margin to burn. To understand the psychological impact of March 6, 1944, one must first understand the trauma of October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, when the 8th Air Force had attempted to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt without long-range fighter escort of 291 B-7 flying fortresses that crossed into German airspace that day. 60 were shot down and 138 damaged, a loss rate of 20.6%, with casualties of over 600 airmen. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated with brutal efficiency that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. General Ira Ecker, commanding the 8th Air Force, was forced to suspend deep penetration raids entirely. General Major Adolf Galland, General Diegfle, General of Fighters, declared October 14th the greatest victory of the Jagdwie in the defensive war in his post-war memoir. The first and the last, he wrote, after Schweinfurt, we believed we had proven that daylight precision bombing was a failed concept. The Americans would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was impossible and damage limited. We had won the theoretical battle. But Galland, brilliant tactician though he was, had made a crucial miscalculation. He assumed the Americans would accept the limitations of existing technology, rather than developing new solutions. When reports of a new American fighter with extraordinary range began reaching his desk in December 1943, he dismissed them when his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January 1944. He accused them of seeing things. It was not until February 20th, 1944, the opening day of Big Week, that Galland began to grasp the magnitude of the threat. The Americans launched 1,000 bombers with 835 fighter escorts, including the first large-scale deployment of P-51Bs over the next 5 days. The Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters, and more critically, 100 experienced pilots, 17% of their available veteran fighter force. Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Galland, Adolf's younger brother, commanding 3 JG-26, reported after Big Week the appearance of Mustangs changed everything before we could position ourselves beyond fighter range and attack the bombers methodically. Now, we had to fight our way through escorts just to reach the bombers, then fight our way out. Every mission became a battle for survival, from takeoff to landing the morning of. March 6, 1944 dawned clear and cold across northern Europe. Perfect flying weather at RAF Laxton in England. Ground crews had been working through the night, preparing the 357th Fighter Group for the most ambitious mission yet attempted, the first P-51 unit to provide escort all the way to Berlin. Colonel Henry Spicer, commanding the 357th Fighter Group, briefed his pilots at 0600 hours. Gentlemen, today we go to Big B. The entire distance will be over enemy territory for 4 hours. Any man who doesn't think his aircraft is in perfect condition should abort now. There will be no second chances at these distances. No one aborted. However, Colonel Spicer himself would abort shortly after takeoff with mechanical problems, leaving Major Thomas L. Hayes to assume command of the historic mission at 8:30. 7:30 heavy bombers began lifting off from bases across East Anglia. Behind them, 796 fighters prepared to provide relay escort, P-47s for the initial penetration, P-38s for the middle phase, and P-51 Mustangs for the deepest penetration and target escort. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 P-51Bs, though only 33 would successfully reach Berlin after mechanical issues and navigation challenges in heavy cloud cover in Germany. The Reich's Jagdführung Reich air defense radar stations began picking up the massive formation as it assembled over the North Sea. The plotters at Doberitz, the primary fighter control center for Berlin's defense, initially assessed this as another feint. The Americans had approached Berlin before, but always turned away to hit targets in western Germany. Avis Hannes Trautloft, commanding the 2nd Fighter Division responsible for Berlin's defense, studied the plot and made a fateful decision. He would hold his fighters on the ground until the bombers committed to their target. No point in wasting fuel if this was another deception. At 11:30 hours, the lead bombers crossed into German airspace near Arnhem. The escorting P-47s engaged German fighters, rising from bases in Holland and western Germany. Everything proceeded according to the established pattern. The Luftwaffe pilots engaged cautiously, waiting for the moment they knew must come, when the American escorts reached their fuel limits and turned back. At 12:55 hours as the bomber stream approached, Berlin Major Hans Kogler led his mixed formation to intercept what they believed would be unescorted bombers. His force consisted of 7 Messed Bf-110 night fighters that had been pressed into day service, along with 41 single-engine Bf-109 German controllers, had tracked the bombers. P-47s turning back and assumed the bombers were now vulnerable. Major Thomas Hayes leading the 357 Fighter Group's 33 Mustangs that had reached Berlin through difficult weather, later described the moment in his combat report. We broke through the cloud layer to see B-24 Liberators below and to our left. Simultaneously, we spotted approximately 40 enemy aircraft positioning for attack, Me-100s and 10s and Me-100s and 9s. They hadn't seen us yet. We had altitude advantage and complete surprise. The German formation focused entirely on the bomber stream, never saw the Mustangs until it was too late. Hayes dove on the enemy fighters, calling out Greenhouse Squadron, this is Greenhouse Leader, Bandits at 2 o'clock, low drop tanks in attack. Feldwebel Jan Müller of GG-11, flying one of the escorting Bf-109s, survived the encounter and later described it. We were in perfect position, just beginning our attack dive on the bombers, when tracers flashed past my canopy. I looked up to see single-engine fighters with American markings diving on us from above. It was impossible. We were over Berlin. My first thought was that these must be captured aircraft, some kind of deception. But then I saw the drop tanks falling away, dozens of them, and I knew these were real American fighters with range we hadn't imagined possible. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. The German fighters, caught completely by surprise and out of position, scattered in confusion. In 12 minutes of combat, the 357th Fighter Group claimed 20 enemy aircraft destroyed without losing a single P-51. Hayes himself shot down a Bf-109 at low level near. Wilson then led other Mustangs in strafing a German airfield at his estate at Carenhol 50 miles north of Berlin. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring was having lunch when the call came through from General Dagfleur Adolf Galland. American fighters were over. Berlin single-engine fighters. You're mistaken, Galland, Göring said flatly. Check your reports again. Herr Reich Marshal, I have visual confirmation from multiple sources. P-51 Mustangs are engaging our fighters over. Potam. At this moment, Goering's rage was volcanic. According to his aide, Aust Bernd von Brejic, who was present, the Reichsmarschall threw his wine glass against the wall and screamed, "This is treason sabotage. The pilots are lying to cover their cowardice. I will have every man who makes such claims court-martialed." But even as Goering raged, the evidence was undeniable. From his own estate, he could see the contrails over. Berlin hear the distant thunder of aircraft engines at full power. His aide would later testify that Goering stood at the window for nearly an hour, watching the sky, saying nothing. That evening, Goering issued his most infamous order of the air war. Any pilot who claims to have seen American single-engine fighters over. Berlin is to be arrested for cowardice and spreading defist propaganda. The maximum range of American fighters is the Ra. This is a scientific fact. The order created chaos in fighter units already reeling from their losses. Pilots who had just survived combat against P-51s were now being threatened with court-martial for reporting what they had seen. Several squadron commanders, including Major Gaurau, simply ignored the order and told their pilots to report twin-engine fighters in their combat reports. General Major Galland, in a heated conference at the Air Ministry on March 8th, presented Goering with a piece of a P-51's drop tank clearly stamped "Made in." USA and recovered from a field near Magdeburg. Goering's response entered Luftwaffe legend. "I don't care if you bring me a hole." Mustang on a silver platter. The Americans cannot escort to Berlin. It's scientifically impossible. It was at this point, according to Galland's memoirs, that he knew Germany had lost the war. Later at Nuremberg, Goering would admit, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." For individual Luftwaffe pilots, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented not just a tactical surprise, but an existential crisis. These were men who had been told repeatedly that they were defending an impregnable fortress, that German science and engineering were superior to anything the Allies could produce. Hauptmann Heinz Knocke, commanding 2nd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary on March 7, 1944, "Yesterday changed everything we had always known, where we were safe, where we could reform, where we could attack without interference. That certainty is gone. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted, even over our own capital." The psychological impact was amplified by the quality of the opposition. The P-51B was not merely present over Berlin, it was dominant. Its Merlin engine gave it a top speed of 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, faster than the Bf-109 G6's 386 miles per hour at the same altitude. Its Laminina float wing provided exceptional high-altitude handling. Its 450 caliber machine guns delivered concentrated firepower, and most crucially, its pilots were fresh, not fatigued from hours of combat at the edge of their fuel reserves. Untapetsia. Vera PC of JG-301 survived an encounter with P-51s on March 9th and described the experience. "They came from above and behind, always with altitude advantage. When we turned to engage, they would zoom climb away. They had the power to go vertical whenever they chose. When we tried to dive away, they followed easily. They fought like they had unlimited fuel, making multiple passes, following us down to low altitude we were used to. American fighters that had to watch their fuel, that would make one pass and continue home. These Mustangs played with us like cats with mice." Johannes Steinhoff, commanding JG-77, would later write about the strategic shift. "We had to assume every bomber formation had Mustang escort, even if we couldn't see them. No more large formation attacks, no more taking time to position ourselves. We had to go in immediately, with whatever we had, accept higher losses, and hope to get through to the bombers before the Mustangs found us." The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin coincided with and accelerated another crisis that was slowly strangling the Luftwaffe fuel shortage. Germany had always been dependent on synthetic fuel production, converting coal to aviation gasoline through the Burgess hydrogenation process. This required massive industrial plants that were vulnerable to precision bombing before March 1944. These synthetic fuel plants had been largely immune from attack. They were too far from England for accurate bombing with fighter escort. The mathematics were simple. Without escort, bombers couldn't survive over the target long enough for precision bombing. Without precision, the massive concrete structures of the hydrogenation plants were unlikely to be seriously damaged. The Mustang changed this equation overnight on May 12, 1944. The 8th Air Force launched its first major attack against the synthetic fuel plant at Luna, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. 800 bombers escorted by 735 fighters, including 298 P-51s, delivered 1,718 tons of bombs with unprecedented accuracy production at Luna dropped 90% overnight. By June 1944, German aviation fuel production had fallen from 175,000 tons per month to 35,000 tons by September. It was down to 7,000 tons, barely enough to fuel 500 sorties per day across all fronts. Training flights were cancelled entirely. New pilots were being sent into combat with as little as 50 hours total flight time, compared to the 250 hours that had been standard in 1942. A veteran pilot who had transferred from the Eastern Front to Reich defense described the deteriorating situation by summer 1944. We were limited to one training flight per week, then one per month, then none at all. New pilots arrived at our units, having never fired their guns in flight, never practiced formation flying, never engaged in mock combat. They were lambs to the slaughter. The shortage wasn't just fuel, it was experience, confidence, everything that makes a fighter pilot the true measure of that. Mustang's impact became clear on June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, required absolute air superiority over the beaches. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties on. D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed 319, losing 35 aircraft in the process. Over the actual invasion beaches, only 2 German fighters appeared throughout the entire day. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commanding JG-26, led the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches with his wingman, Unreitery Haynes. Vodacek, he made a single strafing run on Sword Beach before being chased away by Spitfires. In his post-war memoir, Priller wrote, "2 planes, that's all we could manage against the greatest invasion in history, not because we lacked courage, but because we lacked fuel. We lacked aircraft, and above all, we lacked air superiority. The Mustangs had taken that from us months before, not over Normandy, but over Berlin. Major Vero, who had commanded G-54 and claimed A. P-51 on May 24, 1944, reflected on the strategic situation after the Mustangs appeared over Berlin. We never regained the initiative. We were always reacting, always defending, always outnumbered. The Americans could strike anywhere, at any time, with fighter escort. We could barely defend our own airfields. The war in the air was lost the moment they could reach. Berlin in desperation, the Luftwaffe developed increasingly suicidal tactics. The Sturmgruppen assault group concept epitomized this desperation. FW-190A-8s were modified with additional armor plating, 30mm cannons, and reinforced windscreens. These flying tanks would bore straight through fighter screens to attack bombers at point-blank range. Major Walter Dahl, who had taken command of JG-300 on June 27, 1944, became the most famous proponent of these tactics. On July 7, 1944, Dahl led Sturm JG-3 with support from 2 group of Bf-109s from JG-300 in a massive assault against B-24 Liberators near Leipzig, the heavily armored. FW-119s managed to destroy an entire squadron of 12 B-24s from the 492nd Bomb Group in less than a minute, but the cost was catastrophic. Of the STM grouper fighters launched, 9 were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The escorting Bf-109s fared even worse against the Mustang escorts. The tactics that had worked briefly in July became increasingly suicidal as American fighter strength grew. Oberfeld. Wabel Conrad Bauer, one of the few Sturmgruppen pilots to survive multiple missions, described the reality: we were flying coffins. The armor that was supposed to protect us made us so slow that the Mustangs could make multiple firing passes at leisure. The order was to ram if our guns jammed. But how could we ram when we couldn't even reach the bombers through the fighter screen? Each mission was Russian roulette with all chambers loaded. Germany's last hope lay in revolutionary technology. The Messerschmitt Me-262, Swallow, the world's first operational jet fighter with a top speed of 540 miles per hour. It was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D. In the hands of experienced pilots, it could have changed the air war, but the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. More critically, Hitler's insistence that it be used as a blitz bomber rather than a fighter interceptor wasted precious months. By the time significant numbers were available for fighter operations in late 1944, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel to train pilots in their operation and the airfields to operate them safely. Adolf Galland, who had been dismissed as General Diagfleger for his criticism of Hitler's policies, was given command of JV-44, an elite jet unit formed in February 1945, even with Germany's best surviving pilots flying the world's most advanced fighter. They could not overcome the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied forces. Galland himself described the futility. We would take off, shoot down one or two bombers or fighters, and land to find our airfield under attack by Mustangs. They hunted us on the ground, catching Me-262s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases for every minute we were in the air. At historians would later call the death of the expert. The veteran pilots, who had scored dozens or even hundreds of victories, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The appearance of Mustangs deep inside Germany meant there was no safe space to train replacements, no quiet sector where novices could gain experience. The statistics tell a grim story. In 1940, new Luftwaffe pilots received 250 hours of flight training before combat. By 1944, this had been reduced to 80 hours. By early 1945, some pilots were sent into combat with as little as 20 hours in type. Meanwhile, American pilots arriving in England had 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including 100 hours in type and extensive gunnery training. Johannes Steinhoff, who would survive terrible burns when his Me-262 crashed on takeoff in April 1945, later reflected, "We were sending children to their deaths. Boys who could barely fly formation were expected to engage Mustang pilots with hundreds of combat hours. It wasn't combat. It was murder." I stopped looking at the replacement pilots' faces. I knew most would be dead within a week. The loss rates confirmed this assessment. In January 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 7 missions. Some units experienced 100% turnover in a month. JG-301, once an elite unit, lost 82 pilots in the first 3 months of 1945, while claiming only 41 victories. Lieutenant G.A., who survived the war with 3 victories, provided a newly qualified pilot's perspective. My first mission was supposed to be a training flight, a patrol over Brunswick, with experienced pilots. We were bounced by Mustangs before we even formed up properly. My flight leader was killed in the first pass. I never saw the Mustang that shot at me, only the tracers passing my canopy. I dove to treetop level and flew home alone. That was my combat training. While the Luftwaffe bled in the skies, American bombing was relentlessly destroying German aircraft production. The Mustang's long range meant no factory was. Safety. The contrails layered into a pale lattice above the Capitol, the air tasting of cold metal as headsets crackled. Somewhere below, a thin ribbon of smoke lifted from a struck airfield, and the Merlin's surge under the throttle felt like a heartbeat, a warning that what began over Brandenburg was about to cut deeper, with no refuge left on the ground. The contrails layered into a pale lattice above the Capitol, the air tasting of cold metal as headsets crackled. Somewhere below, a thin ribbon of smoke lifted from a struck airfield, and the Merlin's surge under the throttle felt like a heartbeat, a warning that what began over Brandenburg was about to cut deeper, with no refuge left on the ground. The next minutes stripped away any illusion of sanctuary as escort fighters drove past the bomber stream and began hunting, forcing every decision on the defenders into a race they could no longer win. Y Strip's pilots lived like hunted animals, moving constantly to avoid the omnipresent Mustangs. Obus Gordon Golob, one of the few senior commanders still alive, issued orders that revealed the desperation aircraft. "We'll take off only when enemy bombers are directly overhead. Maximum sortie duration 15 minutes. Any pilot airborne longer than 20 minutes will be presumed to have defected. The fear of." Mustangs had become so pervasive that many pilots would abort missions at the first report of escort fighters. Courts-martial for cowardice became common, though executing experienced pilots when so few remained was counterproductive. Morale collapsed entirely when pilots realized that even successful missions achieved nothing. The bombers kept coming. The Mustangs kept escorting them, and Germany kept dying. Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, with 99 victories, was shot down and killed on December 23rd, 1944. One victory short of becoming a century ace, his wingman reported 6 Mustangs. They came from above and behind. Heinrich never had a chance. They followed him down, firing continuously. Even after his aircraft was burning, they kept shooting. They wanted to make sure this ruthlessness was new. Earlier in the war, there had been a degree of chivalry. Pilots who bailed out were generally not attacked. Damaged aircraft trying to withdraw were sometimes allowed to escape. But by 1945, American pilots had seen too many. Friends die, knew the war's end was near, and wanted to ensure the Luftwaffe could never recover. Every German pilot killed was one who couldn't fly the jets or advanced fighters. Germany was still trying to develop. American Mustang pilots were remarkably consistent in their assessment of the campaign's progression. Colonel John C. Emmer, who scored 24 aerial victories, provided this analysis from March to June 1944. We fought the Luftwaffe's first team, experienced, aggressive, skilled. From June to December, we faced their second line, still dangerous but less coordinated. By 1945, we were shooting down students, kids who could barely fly formation, let alone fight. It wasn't satisfying. It was necessary but tragic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. England, commanding the 362nd Fighter Squadron, observed the Mustang didn't just give us range, it gave us psychological dominance. German pilots knew that if they saw Mustangs, they were probably going to die. We could see it in their tactics early on. They'd attack aggressively, even when outnumbered. By late 44, they'd run at the first sight of us. By 45, many wouldn't even take off, if. Mustangs were reported in the area. Captain Charles Chuck Jorger, who would later break the sound barrier, scored 11.5 victories in Mustangs. His assessment was characteristically direct. The P-51 was an honest airplane. It told you what it was going to do. It had no vices. If you treated it right against German fighters in 44 and 45, it was like having a rifle when they had muskets. We had every advantage: speed, range, altitude, and numbers. It wasn't a fair fight, but war isn't supposed to be fair. Perhaps the most telling testimony came from bomber crews whose lives depended on fighter escort technical. Sergeant William McManus, a B-17 gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, recalled, "Before the Mustangs, every mission felt like suicide. We'd watch our escort turn back and know the wolves were coming. After, seeing those Mustangs with us all the way to target and back, it was like having guardian angels. Our loss rate went from probably going to die to probably going to make it home." The P-51's success was not just a triumph of design, but of production. North American Aviation's plants in Englewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, achieved production rates that seemed impossible by German standards. At peak production in 1944, North American was completing one. Mustang, every 63 minutes, the assembly line adapted from automobile manufacturing, broke construction into specialized stations. Workers became experts at single tasks, achieving speeds and precision impossible with traditional aircraft manufacturing methods. Paul Peters, a production supervisor at Englewood, described the system. "We had housewives installing control cables, teenagers riveting wing panels, men too old for the draft assembling engines. None of them had built an airplane before the war, but the system was so well designed that within weeks they were producing perfect work. We had quality control at every station. If something wasn't right, the line stopped until it was fixed." The contrast with German production was stark. As Allied bombing forced dispersal, German aircraft were being assembled in caves, forests, and abandoned mines. Different components might be manufactured hundreds of miles apart. Quality control was impossible. Workers were often slave laborers who had every incentive to sabotage production. A bust. Dietrich Rabeck, who commanded various fighter units throughout the war, observed, "We would receive new aircraft that looked perfect, but were flying coffins. Control cables installed incorrectly, fuel lines that leaked, guns that wouldn't fire. The Americans were building better aircraft in greater numbers with workers who wanted to win. We were building inferior aircraft in smaller numbers with workers who wanted us to lose." The success of the P-51 over Berlin had implications far beyond the European theater. It demonstrated that air power could be projected globally. That distance was no longer a barrier to American reach. This lesson was not lost on Japan, which watched its defensive perimeter shrink as American long-range fighters enabled bombing campaigns against the home islands. Stalin too took notice. Soviet pilots who flew Lendl P-51s were impressed by their range and reliability. The Soviet Air Force began developing long-range escort fighters, understanding that future conflicts would require power projection over vast distances. The VVS Soviet Air Force received 10 P-51s and tested them extensively, though they were never used in combat by Soviet forces. The Mustang continued serving long after World War II ended in Korea. F-51s. The designation changed in 1948, flew close support missions. The Israeli Air Force used Mustangs in the 1956 Suez Crisis. Various air forces flew Mustangs into the 1980s. The Dominican Air Force retired their last F-51D in 1984, 40 years after it first flew over Berlin. But the Mustang's greatest legacy was doctrinal. It proved that air superiority was not just about controlling airspace over the battlefield, but about controlling airspace over entire nations. Every modern Air Force builds its strategy around this lesson, first demonstrated when American fighters appeared over Berlin on March 6, 1944. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were human beings, young men mostly in their early 20s, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin meant different things to different people, but for all, it was a moment of profound realization. For American pilots, it was vindication. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote home, "We flew over Hitler's capital today. Think about that. We took off from England, flew across all of Germany, circled Berlin like we owned it, because we did, and flew home 2 years ago. The Nazis were bombing. London today, we own the sky over Berlin. It's hard to describe the feeling. Pride, power, and the absolute certainty that we're going to win this war for." German pilots, it was the spare-feldable Rudi Müller of JG-302 wrote to his wife, "I saw them today, American fighters over Berlin, single-engine fighters, it's impossible. But I saw them with my own eyes. If they can reach Berlin, they can reach anywhere. There is no safe place left in Germany. How do? I tell you that I don't expect to survive this. How do I explain that everything we believed was wrong? For German civilians, it was the beginning of the end of illusion. Berlin." Ursula von Kardor wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans were weak, that their Jewish-controlled society could never match German strength. Today I watched American fighters circle overhead, while our vaunted Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Everything they told us was lies. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about for? Allied bomber crews, it was Salvation Staff. Sergeant James McMahon, ball turret gunner on B-7 Lucky Lady, recalled, seeing those Mustangs form up on us as we approached. Berlin, I'm not ashamed to say I cried for the first time since I started flying missions. I thought I might actually survive this war. Those little friends with the big range saved thousands of us as the war ended. The full magnitude of what the Mustang had achieved became clear. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the war as arguably the world's most powerful air force, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The statistics are staggering. Total Luftwaffe aircraft lost 1944 to 45, approximately 45,000 Luftwaffe pilots. Killed 1944 to 45, approximately 15,000. Percentage of Luftwaffe pilots operational in January 1944 who survived the war uninjured, less than 5%. German cities destroyed by bombing. 61% over 50% destruction. German civilian casualties from bombing. 350,000 to 500,000. German industrial production lost to bombing, 35 to 40%. These numbers represent not just military defeat, but societal collapse. The Mustang had enabled a campaign that brought war to every German city, every factory, every airfield. There was no rear area, no safe haven, no respite Hermann. Goering, on trial at Nuremberg, was asked when he knew Germany had lost the war. His answer became one of the most quoted statements of the conflict. When I saw American fighters over Berlin, the game was finished. Everything after that was just delay, just more dead young men for no purpose. It was a remarkably candid admission from a man not known for honesty. But even Goering, master of denial and delusion, could not deny what the Mustang represented. American industrial power married to British innovation, projected across impossible distances with ruthless efficiency. The P-51's development, from initial concept to Berlin Escort fighter, represents one of the most rapid and successful aircraft development programs in history. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, just 102 days after North American aviation received the British purchasing commission's request by March 1944. Less than 4 years later, it was escorting bombers to Berlin. This speed of development was matched by continuous improvement based on combat experience. Each version incorporated lessons learned. P-51A, Allison engine, limited high-altitude performance. P-51B, Packard Merlin F-1650, 3-engine, transformed performance above 20,000 feet. P-51D, bubble canopy, 6 guns, improved systems. V-1650, 7-engine. P-51H, lightened structure, peak performance, never saw combat in Europe. The feedback loop combat experience driving rapid design improvement was something the German system, with its chaotic leadership and disrupted production, could not match. While German engineers produced technically excellent designs like the TAR-152H or Mi-262, they couldn't refine them based on combat experience or produce them in meaningful numbers, the appearance of. Mustangs over Berlin validated the entire American strategic bombing concept. Pre-war theorists like Billy Mitchell and Julio Dewey had argued that bombing could win wars by destroying enemy industry and morale, but until long-range escort was available, this remained theory. The Mustang made precision daylight bombing possible, while the British continued area bombing at night. Americans could now put bombs precisely on specific facilities: ball bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft assembly buildings. The accuracy difference was dramatic. British night bombing achieved an average circular error of 3 miles. American daylight bombing with fighter escort achieved 1,000 feet. General Curtis Lame, who would later lead Strategic Air Command, stated, "The P-51 made strategic bombing work. Without it, we would have had to accept either unsustainable losses or ineffective night bombing. With it, we could methodically destroy specific target sets. We didn't just bomb. Germany, we performed industrial surgery, removing their ability to make war. The results spoke for themselves. German ball bearing production reduced 70%. Aviation fuel production reduced 95%. Synthetic rubber production reduced 85%. Railroad traffic reduced 75%. Canal traffic eliminated entirely. In Western Germany, this precise application of force, made possible by Mustang escorts, shortened the war by months, or possibly years. Every factory destroyed, every rail line cut, every fuel depot burned meant German forces couldn't fight effectively. The image of Mustangs over Berlin became one of the iconic visuals of World War II ranking, with the flag raising on Iwo Jima, or Soviet soldiers at the Reichstag. It represented American power projection, technological superiority, and the certainty of Allied victory for Americans. The Mustang became a symbol of their nation's industrial and technological prowess. It was featured in war bond posters, Hollywood films, and post-war celebrations. The fact that it was designed and built in record time by a company that had never produced a fighter before embodied the American can-do spirit. For Germans, the Mustang represented humiliation and defeat. Post-war German literature and films often feature the image of American fighters over German cities as a symbol of the regime's failure to protect its people. The trauma of being unable to defend one's own airspace left lasting psychological scars on the Luftwaffe veterans who survived. Heinz Koka, writing in 1953, reflected, "For a fighter pilot, the ultimate duty is to protect your homeland skies. We failed thee." Mustangs over Berlin were proof of our failure, visible to every German who looked up. That shame never fully goes away. Military men's worldwide still study the Mustang's impact on the European air war as a case study in how technology can create strategic revolution. The lessons are timeless. Range equals options. The ability to project power at distance provides strategic flexibility. The Mustang gave Allied commanders options the Germans couldn't counter. Integration beats isolation. The Mustang succeeded, not alone, but as part of an integrated system. Bombers, fighters, intelligence, logistics, training. The Germans had excellent individual components, but couldn't integrate them effectively. Production wins wars. Building vast numbers of good aircraft beats small numbers of excellent aircraft. The Mustang was excellent, But more importantly, there were thousands of them. Pilot quality matters. Technology without trained operators is useless. American pilot training programs, with their emphasis on flight hours and realistic combat training, produced pilots who could exploit the Mustang's capabilities fully. Adaptation is survival. The Americans continuously improved tactics, technology, and training based on combat experience. The Germans, hidebound by rigid doctrine and political interference, couldn't adapt quickly enough. Modern air forces apply these lessons daily. The emphasis on long-range strike capability, integrated air defense systems, pilot training, and industrial-based preservation all stem from lessons learned when Mustangs first appeared over Berlin. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin on March 6, 1944, marked more than a tactical milestone. It was the moment. Nazi Germany's fundamental assumptions about the war collapsed. The Reich was supposed to be a fortress, protected by distance, defended by the world's best pilots, flying the world's best fighters. But Mustang shattered these illusions in a single morning. For the German leadership, military and political, it was a moment of terrible clarity. They had based their entire strategy on the Americans being unable to project power across the Atlantic effectively. They had dismissed American industrial capacity as inefficient, American technology as inferior, American pilots as soft. Every assumption was wrong, and the Mustangs over Berlin were proof that couldn't be denied, propagandized away or ignored. Adolf Galland would later write, March 6, 1944 was the day we lost the war, not when Berlin fell, not when Hitler died, but when American fighters appeared over our capital. Everything after was just the playing out of a foregone conclusion. The Mustang didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe. It proved that American industrial democracy could outproduce, out-innovate, and outfight Nazi totalitarianism. The psychological impact rippled through German society. If the regime couldn't protect Berlin from American fighters, what could it do if everything they'd been told about American weakness was false? What else was false? The Mustang became an unwitting agent of truth. Its presence over German cities proved that the Nazi worldview was built on lies. While the Mustang's success was decisive, it came at a cost. 2,520 P-51s were lost in combat in the European theater. Behind each loss was a young man who would never come home, the 357th. Fighter Group alone lost over 100 pilots killed in action. These were the best America had to offer. College students, athletes, young professionals who volunteered to fly and fight. Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, commanding officer of the 339th Fighter Group, was killed on March 31, 1944, when his P-51B was hit by flak near Brunswick. He was 28 years old, married with 2 children he would never see grow up. His loss was replicated thousands of times. Young men who paid the ultimate price for the strategic victory. Mustang achieved Captain Don Gentile, one of the war's top Mustang aces, with 21.83 aerial victories, survived combat only to die in a flying accident in January 1951, testing a T-33 jet trainer. The war's echoes continued long after the shooting stopped. Many Mustang pilots struggled with what they had seen and done, carrying psychological wounds that never fully healed. But their sacrifice achieved something remarkable. They had taken the war to the enemy's homeland, forced the enemy to fight over his own territory, and won decisively. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin. From that day forward, it was a broken force, capable only of sporadic, ineffective resistance as dawn broke on. May 8, 1945, VE Day, American Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany. There was no opposition. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized Europe, that had seemed invincible in 1940, no longer existed. Its aircraft were destroyed or grounded for lack of fuel. Its pilots were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Its infrastructure was rubble. The transformation from March 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, just 14 months, represents one of the most complete military victories in history. The P-51 Mustang had been the instrument of that victory, the tool that turned Allied air power from a costly liability into an irresistible force. In those 14 months, Mustang pilots had flown over 213,000 sorties, claimed 4,950 aerial victories, destroyed 4,131 aircraft on the ground, dropped 31,000 tons of bombs, fired 99 million rounds of ammunition. Behind these statistics was a human reality. young. American men, average age 22, flying aluminum aircraft powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, had comprehensively destroyed one of history's most formidable air forces. They had done it not through individual heroics, though there was plenty of that, but through superior technology, training, tactics, and industrial support. Colonel Hubert Hub Zanka, one of the war's most successful fighter commanders, provided perhaps the best epitaph for the Luftwaffe. They were magnificent opponents who were simply overwhelmed. We had more of everything. More planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training, more range. The Mustang gave us the ability to apply that more, anywhere we chose. Once we could escort to Berlin, the mathematics of victory became inevitable. When Major Hans Kogler saw those first Mustangs over Brandenburg on March 6, 1944, he witnessed more than enemy fighters. He witnessed the future of air warfare. The P-51 Mustang had proven that technology could overcome distance, that industrial capacity could triumph over individual skill, that methodical approach could defeat improvised brilliance. The shocked German pilots who encountered Mustangs over Berlin were not just facing a superior aircraft. They were facing the combined industrial, technological, and organizational power of the United States projected across an ocean and deep into the heart of their homeland. It was a demonstration of force that shattered every assumption about what was possible in aerial warfare. Hermann Göring's admission about knowing the war was lost when he saw American fighters over Berlin has become one of history's most telling acknowledgments of defeat. But the full significance of that moment extends beyond one man's realization or even one nation's defeat. The appearance of Mustangs over Berlin represented a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. The moment when air power became truly strategic, when industrial capacity became more important than warrior tradition, when organized efficiency triumphed over individual heroism. The German pilots who were shocked by Mustangs over Berlin had witnessed something that would echo through the decades, the projection of American power across vast distances with precision and overwhelming force. Every modern military intervention, from Korea to Kosovo, from Vietnam to the Gulf War, has built upon the foundation laid when those first Mustangs appeared in the skies over Brandenburg. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang did more than escort bombers or shoot down German fighters. It shattered the last illusions of a regime built on lies about racial superiority and national destiny. It proved that free societies, despite their apparent chaos and inefficiency, could organize, innovate, and project power more effectively than totalitarian states. It demonstrated that technology and industry, properly applied, could overcome any defensive advantage of geography or position. The Luftwaffe pilots who looked up in shock at those silver Mustangs on March 6, 1944, were witnessing their own obsolescence. Within 14 months, their entire force would be destroyed, their nation occupied, their ideology discredited. The shock of seeing impossible American fighters over Berlin was the beginning of a cascade of revelations that would end with Germany's complete defeat and transformation, today preserved. P-51 Mustangs still fly at air shows, their distinctive Merlin engines producing a sound that veterans of that era recognize instantly for. American veterans, it's the sound of victory. For German veterans, it's the sound that announced the beginning of the end. For historians, it's the sound that changed warfare forever. The moment when one nation proved it could project decisive air power anywhere on Earth. The story of Luftwaffe pilots shocked by P-51 Mustangs over Berlin is ultimately a story about the collision between assumption and reality, between propaganda and truth, between what was thought impossible and what American industry made routine. When those Mustangs appeared over Berlin, they didn't just shock the Luftwaffe pilots who saw them. They shocked an entire worldview into extinction. But from that wreckage would rise something new. Many of the German pilots who survived the shock of Mustangs over Berlin would help build the post-war Luftwaffe of democratic Germany, allied with the very nation whose fighters had destroyed their comrades. Johannes Steinhoff would rise to become Chief of Staff of the new German Air Force, and eventually chairman of the NATO Military Committee. In 1983, he would stand beside American generals who had flown Mustangs against him, united in defense of the freedom that his former enemies had brought to his defeated nation. This transformation from mortal enemies to steadfast allies was perhaps the most profound shock of all. Mustangs that had appeared over Berlin hadn't just brought destruction, they had ultimately brought liberation. The German pilots, who had been shocked by their appearance in 1944, would in time come to understand that those American fighters had freed them from a criminal regime that had led them to disaster. The last word belongs to Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, who had denied, then witnessed, then survived the Mustang onslaught. In 1984, at a reunion of American and German fighter pilots in San Antonio, Texas, he raised the glass to his former enemies and said, "You shocked us when your Mustangs appeared over. Berlin, you shocked us with your industry, your technology, your determination. But the greatest shock came after the war, when you helped us rebuild, when you protected us from Soviet aggression, when you became our friends. The Mustangs over Berlin didn't just end a war, they began a peace. For that, we who survived are forever grateful. The circle was complete. The shock that had begun with